March 23, 1945, near Remagen, Germany. The wind that night carried the taste of smoke and iron. Across the broken fields near the Rhine, the distant thunder of artillery echoed like a dying heartbeat. The war in Europe was in its last convulsions, but to those who fought beneath that sky, it still felt endless. Amid the ruins of a small German village, a crumbling schoolhouse had been turned into a field hospital. Its walls, once painted with children's lessons, were now covered in soot, blood, and makeshift bandages hung to dry by the fading light of kerosene lamps. Inside, Nurse Eleanor Whitfield moved between stretchers with mechanical precision. Her uniform was no longer white, but gray from ash and dirt. Every few seconds, the windows rattled as the front line crawled closer. She tightened a bandage on a soldier's leg, checked another's pulse, then looked toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. A doctor, a miracle, anyone. But no one came. The only sound was the breathing of the wounded, uneven and fading. Each exhale felt like a countdown she couldn't stop. Supplies were almost gone. The morphine bottles lay empty in a wooden crate. The last transfusion kit had broken the day before. What remained was willpower, thin, fraying, but unbroken. Outside, flares burned above the horizon, turning the low clouds red. The air was thick with frost and cordite. Eleanor moved to the window and stared out at the snow-dusted field. The men called her Angel, but she didn't feel like one. Angels didn't bleed through their gloves or cry quietly between patients. Angels didn't feel this helpless. Then it came, a sound she'd learned to fear more than any other. A low hum, deep, metallic, growing louder. She froze. Her instincts screamed before her mind caught up. It wasn't artillery. It was the drone of engines. The kerosene lamp flickered. Someone groaned from a cot. And then a whistling. Sharp, descending. She barely had time to look up. The world detonated. The roof split open as the Luftwaffe's bomb struck the ridge beside the building. The explosion tore through the structure like a giant's fist, hurling metal, glass, and fire in all directions. The force slammed her into the wall. The light vanished. For a moment, there was only silence. When she opened her eyes again, she couldn't hear anything. Only a dull ringing filled her skull. Dust hung in the air like fog. The ceiling was gone. The night sky looked down through a hole where children once learned arithmetic. The floor was scattered with bodies, men she'd tended moments ago, now motionless, half buried under rubble. Her hands shook as she crawled forward, calling out, though she couldn't hear her own voice. Her mouth formed names, pleas, prayers. No answer came. Then she felt a pulse. Weak, but there. She began digging with her bare hands, dragging stones and beams off a trapped soldier. Her palms split open. Blood mixed with dust. She didn't stop. By the time she pulled the man free, her breath was ragged, her vision blurry. But when she looked around, she saw movement, others still breathing. Maybe a dozen, maybe less. The rest were gone. She pushed herself up, limping toward the corner where a medical box had survived the blast. Inside, a few gauze strips, some alcohol, and a broken syringe. She exhaled slowly. It'll have to do, she whispered to herself, though no one could hear. Outside, faint voices drifted on the wind, distant, indistinguishable. She couldn't tell if they were German or Allied. The war didn't care. She dragged the wounded into the one room that still had half a roof. A lantern still burned there, flickering weakly. She propped up a door as a makeshift table, laid one soldier across it, and began stitching by trembling light. For hours she worked without pause. The snow outside thickened, melting into the cracks of the broken walls. Her body screamed for rest, but her hands refused to obey. Every heartbeat she saved felt like a small victory stolen from the jaws of death itself. And then, silence again. Not peace. The kind of silence that means something terrible is coming. She straightened, knife still in hand, listening. Through the shattered doorway, something moved. The crunch of boots on shattered glass. Her pulse quickened. The sound was wrong, too measured, too slow. Not the stumbling of survivors. It was someone searching. The lantern flickered. Her breath formed white ghosts in the cold. She crouched low, peering through the shadows. Nothing. Only smoke and the distant moan of a wounded man. Minutes passed. Then, from outside, a faint metallic click. The sound of a rifle being readied. She froze. The fear was sharp, cold, and familiar, the kind she'd learned to master in Burma, years before, when the jungle had hidden enemies in every rustling leaf. But this was different. She was unarmed, surrounded by men too broken to fight. Her heart pounded. She moved silently toward the far corner, pulling a collapsed beam against the doorframe, creating a fragile barricade. If it was a German patrol, she wouldn't have time to hide. But the footsteps faded, slow, uncertain, then gone. Still, she didn't breathe until several minutes later. The lantern dimmed, the flame shrinking to a faint orange glow. The wounded stirred. One muttered for water, another coughed weakly. Eleanor tore part of her sleeve, dipped it in melted snow, and pressed it to his lips. He opened his eyes barely. "Still alive," she murmured, more to herself than to him. But she could feel it. They were all fading. Too much blood lost, too few resources. She needed transfusions, plasma, something to keep them going until rescue arrived. But rescue wouldn't come until morning. Maybe later. She knelt in the debris, running her fingers through the wreckage. Her hand brushed against rubber, a torn oxygen mask. The tubing was intact. An idea began to take shape, wild and dangerous. She shook her head, whispering, "No, it's forbidden." But she couldn't ignore it. The memory came back in a flash. Burma, 1942. The jungle heat, the cries of the wounded. A British captain named Hawthorne had once defied orders and connected one soldier's vein to another, using improvised tubing and prayer. It had worked once, and killed others. She stared at the mask in her hands. Around her, 12 men clung to life, their breaths shallow, fading like candlelight. And then, quietly, she made her decision. She began to cut the tubing into segments, sterilizing them with the last of the alcohol. Her hands moved with grim precision, guided by instinct more than logic. She tied the ends, fashioned crude connections, and began preparing the first transfusion. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, almost peaceful. But inside that broken schoolhouse, a nurse was about to cross a line few dared even to imagine. She looked at the unconscious soldier on the table, then at another beside him. One strong, one dying. Their blood types, she guessed from memory. It would have to be enough. She inserted the makeshift tubing, creating a fragile bridge between two lives. Her own heart pounded as the first drops of blood began to flow. She held her breath. The wounded man's chest rose, once, twice, and then steadied. It was working. A tear slid down her cheek, though she didn't notice. She moved to the next pair, repeating the process. Then another. Each connection was a gamble, each life a coin tossed into fate's hands. The night dragged on. The wind screamed through the holes in the wall. Her fingers numbed from the cold. But she kept going. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the smoke, 12 men still breathed. 12 pulses still beat. And Eleanor Whitfield, the nurse who refused to surrender, sat slumped against the wall, her uniform soaked in blood that wasn't all theirs. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted in a faint smile. She'd done the unthinkable. And outside, beyond the ruined schoolhouse, the sound of engines returned. But this time, they weren't allied. Dawn arrived not as light, but as a suggestion of gray along the shattered horizon. The ruined schoolhouse breathed in shallow drafts, each gust carrying ash, frost, and the faint metallic scent of blood. Inside, the room that still had half a roof looked like a map of survival scratched onto rubble. Lantern guttering low, door balanced as a table, bodies positioned in careful sequence, crude lines of rubber running from arm to arm like lifelines strung across a cliff. She had turned chaos into a pattern. Stronger hearts pulsed for weaker ones. Donors were rotated by instinct, by urgency, by what could still be asked of a body that had already given too much. The method was dangerous, forbidden, and without guarantee, yet the arithmetic of it made a fierce kind of sense. If enough pulses stayed steady long enough, help would arrive to finish what one nurse could not. That was the wager she had placed against the night. Outside, the engines came again. Not the rolling thunder of Allied armor growing near. Not the quick stutter of friendly scouting jeeps. These were steadier, colder, and too orderly for luck. It was the sound of a hunt reconvening at first light. She counted breaths anyway. She adjusted lines anyway. She kept her focus on numbers, because numbers could not panic. 12 living. For borderline. 2 tipping into the dark and clawing their way back because a stranger's pulse was dragging them uphill. Her mind walked a quiet corridor of triage and timing while her body, shaking from cold and blood loss, kept moving because motion meant refusal, and refusal was the only weapon left. Then the first shadow crossed the blasted doorway. It arrived with the same calm as the sound of the engines. Gray uniform, muzzle leading the body, breath clouding in the air. It paused when it saw the scene, Men who should have been silent now breathing in ragged rhythm, rubber tubing drawn from wreckage, a lantern guttering beside a nurse who looked less like a woman and more like strategy made flesh. What followed moved slowly, like orders transmitted through fog. More figures. Helmets. Caution that masked surprise. Their purpose had been to confirm nothing lived here worth recording. Instead, they had discovered the improbable, a ward conjured out of a tomb. Weapons stayed trained, but the room's balance shifted when the intruders saw that most of these bodies did not wear the uniforms of their own. Reflexes warred with something older than uniforms. Even enemy hands hesitate over the dying. The nurse did not plead. She could not have, even if she had wanted to. The part of her that had spoken in the night had gone quiet now, conserved for one last push. She catalogued faces and positions the way she had catalogued tourniquets and pulses. Her eyes asked only for time. The rest would be decided by the arithmetic of what these men could live with afterward when silence returned. They spread out through the room, boots cracking glass that had once been windows, now snowing down in 1,000 prisms on the floor. One stepped forward, read the situation like a mechanic reads a failing engine. Lines in, lines out, sources and destinations, pressure and return. Another checked the hall for movement and signaled the all clear. The lantern flared and shrank, tugged by the drafts that this new traffic created. The nurse shifted her weight and nearly collapsed. She steadied herself on the door table and went back to work. The logic of what she had built insisted on continuation. To stop was to undo. To undo was to kill. What happened next would never be fully agreed upon by any report that tried to trap it in ink. Some who later spoke recalled precision. Others remembered a wordless standstill where time folded in on itself. Yet all accounts, even the ones that contradicted each other, converged on one truth. The men on the floor kept breathing because the nurse kept choosing motion over fear, and the intruders, each in his own measure, allowed that motion to proceed. A decision seemed to pass around the room without language. Weapons lowered by inches, enough to change tone, not enough to cede control. A canteen appeared as if conjured from a pocket no one had watched. A second lantern was set near a pair whose tubing showed air bubbles, and a gloved finger tapped the line to move the bubble along. No one had rehearsed this. War had rehearsed all of them instead. Minutes extended. The room became a problem shared among enemies who forgot themselves long enough to be reminded that bodies are not flags. The nurse moved a donor to preserve a stronger heart for a later pairing. She realigned a splint fashioned from a broken desk leg. She checked capillary refill by lamplight that wasn't bright enough and pretended it was. Her body had limits she had learned to ignore and now would have to defy. She forced water into herself between tasks because the arithmetic of fainting made the darndest kind of sense too, and she could not be one more problem to solve. The numbness in her fingers rose into her wrists and tried to make a home there. She refused it. The room had accepted a temporary treaty written in breath, and she would not be the one to violate it. When the second hour after dawn began, the intruders who had seemed the most urgent when they first appeared acquired a different urgency. They were not supposed to be here. They were part of a larger engine that punished delay. One murmured to another. A look passed around the room, reluctant and practical. Decisions regained edges. The visitor nearer to the door signaled outside, a small, quiet gesture that pulled the moment toward conclusion. That shift did not change the immediate reality in the room. A man who had gasped like a drowning swimmer an hour before now lay still in a way that meant rest, not ruin. Another, whose skin had blanched to candle wax, wore a thin margin of color across his cheeks. The nurse tracked these changes with a bookkeeper's fixation. She logged each victory in a private ledger where the only currency was borrowed time. The last donor failed. The line sagged without the pressure that keeps blood traveling between strangers. The nurse's arithmetic faced a wall. Time, which she had treated like an opponent on an equal field, suddenly towering over her, demanded an answer she had been postponing. She gave it. Her arm became the final bridge. The tubing, cut true in the night, accepted this without ceremony. The system she had built did not judge its sources. A flow began where there had only been hope. The man receiving it crossed back from the ledge with the same uncertain steps the others had taken. The nurse followed him a few feet into the better part of morning before her own body levied its complaint. The edges of the room dissolved. Sound withdrew down a corridor. Vision folded. She did not fall like someone surprised. She descended like someone who had made the terms clear to herself beforehand. The weight that hit the floor brought no panic to the room because the pattern continued. Lines still whispered through tubing. Donors still measured their pulses against need. The temporary treaty still held. The intruders moved because now they had to. A glance to the doorway became a command none could ignore. The one with the canteen set it down within reach of a survivor who might need it later. The second lantern was turned so its meager light faced the sutured wounds instead of the door. From outside came the deeper rumble that ends fragile arrangements. They lifted her carefully. Not because she wore their uniform, but because she had ceased to be anything but a person they could not drop. She was carried out into air that felt cleaner than it was. Snow, real or ash, who could tell, landed on a face that did not notice. For a moment the sky seemed closer than the ground. What happened beyond that threshold was never agreed upon either. Reports written later flattened the hour into a sentence and signed it off with the comfort of closure. Those who had been there, on either side of the argument the war had become, remembered something with more contours. A stretcher that appeared from a vehicle not meant to carry one. A name nearly spoken and then swallowed. A last look between people who did not have words that fit what they had done together. And then departure quick, because the larger engine had resumed its demand. Allied rescuers reached the ruins soon after, called by the same arithmetic that had ruled the nurse's night. They found the scene the way careful hands leave a table for the next shift. 12 living. Lines that looked like a madman's experiment and behaved like the simplest truth. The door that had been a table. The lantern, exhausted but still standing its post. The ledger in her head transferred itself to the hands that arrived with bandage rolls and real transfusion sets. The living were counted again and reclassified as salvageable, transportable, protectable. A few would need operating theaters. All would need time, which had been the rarest thing here and now, suddenly, was abundant because skilled strangers had made it so through the night. Where she had gone was written differently depending on who wrote it down. An official record made a mark that fit a line on a form. Removed from scene, no pulse, presumed dead en route. The stretchers that left the ruin made a different kind of mark in the air behind them. Human weight that would have been absent without one person's refusal to accept the arithmetic of shortages and fear. Days turned into a kind of silence that follows a storm without promising peace. The men she had kept breathing woke in wards far from the ruin and pieced together the night like a story boys tell around a lamp long after they should have been asleep. The tubes, the pairing, the first breath that returned, the rhythm that came back like a drum too far away to march to but close enough to trust. Each detail surfaced and resettled into a narrative that made sense of nonsense. Then the first rumor arrived like a note folded and passed beneath a table. A guard transferring prisoners near the river swore he'd seen a woman in a uniform that wasn't hers doing work that was. A triage tent whispered that a voice-over static had been heard using a call sign no one recognized. A medic claimed that someone had asked for oxygen mask tubing not to breathe with, but to connect with. None of this could be documented in a way that pleased the kind of minds that live in filing cabinets. All of it could be believed by the kind of minds that had heard a heart restart beneath their hands. The arithmetic knitted itself into a legend, because that is what arithmetic does when it is forced to run through human lives. Numbers became a name. The name became a question. The question became a presence that moved through wards and barracks and careful conversations between people who were not supposed to speak to each other, and did anyway because the topic allowed it. On a desk somewhere far from the snow and ash, an officer signed a paper that closed the account on the nurse at the ruined schoolhouse. The phrasing was tidy, the box checked, the ledger balanced. But it did not alter the troublesome facts accruing at the edges. The first portable kits that arrived at the front in the months that followed looked an awful lot like the logic she had used when logic had seemed least available. The protocols that cautioned against direct connections were revisited under new headings that gingerly admitted exceptions when nothing else would suffice. In halls far from the front, lecturers described case studies without names attached, and audiences took careful notes that were, at their core, a way to make sure an improvisation would not die with the moment that invented it. Back near the river where the ruin had once stood, spring made its slow case for itself. Snowmelt chased ash away. Fields tried to remember green. The schoolhouse became a skeleton picked clean by weather and memory. Local children, who should have learned arithmetic inside those walls, learned instead the rumor of a woman who had bent numbers to her will and then walked into a fog no one could measure. They would tell that story to each other the way children always tell stories that adults are careful not to confirm or deny, softly, with the thrill of a secret that is also a prayer. As for the 12 who had breathed because of a pattern sketched under a broken roof, they carried the night with them into lives that grew long again. They married and had children, and then grandchildren who would touch a thin scar in a father's elbow and be told it was where a stranger had kept him alive when there was nothing left to use but the oldest resource one person can give another. They would nod in a solemn way children do when they sense ceremony and not understand it fully, and one day they would. The ledger that had seemed to close with a tidy line kept generating footnotes none could erase. A report surfaced years later that mentioned a coded message sent days after the line had been drawn, its origin muddy, its meaning plain to those who wanted it to be. Lives preserved, mission continues. Another photograph arrived in an envelope without a return address, showing a woman in a place she should not have been doing the work she could not stop doing. Faces argued about whether it was her. Hearts, which rarely ask permission to believe, decided early and moved on. The arithmetic never settled. It did not need to. It had done its work the way bridges do, by holding long enough for others to cross. The room at dawn had been the proof, and the rumor afterward was merely the echo. The larger engine of war kept moving east in that last spring, grinding and sputtering and finally stalling where winters end and reckonings begin. The names and ledgers consolidated into verdicts, into histories, into textbooks, into memorials. Some names outran that machinery and became something else. Hers had begun the transformation the moment she cut the tubing and turned two strangers into a single system. What remained now, in the gray light between memory and record, was a question with such gravity that it pulled other questions into orbit around it. Whether she had been lifted into a truck that belonged to those who had arrived at dawn, or into a different vehicle that had no business stopping at a ruined schoolhouse, and yet did. Whether the last pulse measured against her wrist had been her own or someone else's. Whether the message sent days later was in fact a message, or only hope-seeking. A radio to live inside. The room could not answer. The tubing could not answer. The ledger had done all it could do. The rest would live in the space audiences occupy when the lantern goes out and a narrator's last line pauses just before the next chapter. And in that pause, the story gathered itself for what comes after discovery, after miracle, after tidy endings are written and real endings refuse them. It waited at the threshold for the next voice to pick it up, one that would carry the mystery forward and frame the ledger not as closure, but as origin. It waited because some legends do not resolve. They open. They open into the search. Spring had come to Germany in silence. The artillery had ceased, leaving behind a landscape that no longer trembled, only breathed, unevenly, like an old soldier asleep in a chair. The ruined schoolhouse where the unthinkable had happened was little more than a memory of walls. Ivy began its quiet invasion, threading through broken bricks, covering the burns and the bullet scars. The snow melted, revealing earth that had absorbed everything, fear, hope, and blood. Records were made, reports filed, medals issued. The official story became a footnote in a war too vast for single names to matter. But the legend did not die. It walked quietly through the ranks of survivors, whispered from one hospital bed to another, retold in letters smudged with ink and trembling hands. A nurse, they said, British, gave her own blood, saved us all. Her name, Eleanor Whitfield, was carved into a stone near a British cemetery on the Rhine. The inscription was neat, the date certain, the meaning uncertain. For even as that stone hardened in the sun, the rumors began to move like a second wind. A sergeant in a prisoner exchange camp claimed to have seen her. Same hair, same voice, but dressed in a German medic's coat. Another soldier, half delirious from fever, said a woman with an English accent had tended to him in a makeshift clinic somewhere east of Remagen. She had spoken little, worked tirelessly, and vanished before dawn. Officials dismissed these stories. The mind, they said, invents comfort. Soldiers see ghosts where trauma leaves gaps. Yet the stories refused to fade. They multiplied, adapted, persisted. And each telling ended the same way. She saved lives, on both sides. By late 1945, Allied intelligence began collecting these testimonies, not out of belief but curiosity. A few field reports mentioned coded transmissions intercepted over short-range frequencies. The signal was weak, the content fragmented, but a single repeated phrase kept appearing. Nightingale 2. No unit by that name existed. No nurse by that code was registered. Yet one surviving operator swore he heard a woman's voice before the signal cut. The wounded are safe. Keep moving east. The mystery deepened. Files were opened, cross-referenced, sealed again. Officially, it was unverified radio interference. Unofficially, it became a question no one dared ask out loud. Could someone declared dead have continued her mission behind enemy lines? Years passed. The world rebuilt itself. Cities regained their noise, families returned to laughter, and history began its work of forgetting. Yet in the quiet corners of military hospitals, where old veterans gathered to remember, her name was spoken like a password to something sacred. They remembered the way she moved through chaos, how her hands had steadied even when her body shook. One of them, a man named Private Henry Alcott, one of the 12, never forgot the night she saved him. He lived long enough to tell the story to anyone who would listen. She didn't just save our lives, he once said. She saved the idea that we were worth saving. In 1950, 5 years after her disappearance, a new portable transfusion kit entered U.S. Army service. The M1951 Field Plasma Unit. Its design allowed direct donor-to-recipient transfers using simple tubing and clamps. It looked remarkably similar to what Eleanor had improvised from oxygen masks and courage. The patents bore no name, but the engineers involved had served in Europe. One of them, when asked where the idea originated, smiled and said, "It came from the field." That same year, the British Medical Corps quietly revised its emergency field guidelines, authorizing controlled direct transfusions under extreme conditions. The report cited lessons learned from improvised battlefield techniques, Western Front, 1945. No further details were given, but the war has a long memory. In 1964, 2 decades after her supposed death, the British Ministry of Defense declassified a small collection of coded messages from March 1945. Most were routine transmissions. One, however, stood apart. It was short, precise, and signed with initials. Lives preserved. Mission continues. EW. Analysts dismissed it as a coincidence. But veterans who had served near Remagen felt otherwise. For them, the message was not proof. It was closure, the kind that accepts mystery rather than demands certainty. By then, time had turned her into something larger than fact. She was not just a nurse. She was a symbol of defiance, compassion, and sacrifice without borders. Books were written. Films hinted at her story under different names. Yet the true details remained elusive, buried under the weight of classification and myth. In 1973, a faded photograph surfaced in a Red Cross archive in Geneva. It showed a war-torn hospital near Frankfurt, taken in May 1945. Among the German nurses tending to wounded Allied prisoners stood a woman half-turned toward the camera. Face obscured by shadow, but the stance unmistakable. Hands at her sides, posture straight, head slightly tilted in that same calm focus described by every soldier she had ever treated. The file had no annotation except for 2 words, unknown volunteer. The photo spread quietly through veteran circles. Some swore it was her. Others refused to say. But all agreed on one thing. Even if it wasn't Eleanor, it was someone like her, and that was enough. Because by then, her story had grown beyond identity. She had become an idea. The notion that courage was not only in charging hills or flying bombers, but in refusing to let the wounded die alone. That humanity, even under fire, could break the rules and still win the war in a different way. In 1985, the Royal College of Nursing erected a small plaque in London's Cavendish Square. It carried no photo, no rank, no title, just a single sentence. In memory of those who gave their own blood that others might live. Below it, carved in faint italics, 3 words. The Unthinkable Act. The plaque became a quiet pilgrimage site for medics, veterans, and students who believed in unseen heroes. Some left flowers. Some left notes. One note, found tucked beneath the bronze after a winter storm, read, "If you can still hear us, thank you. We carried your heartbeat forward." The writer had not signed it. By the turn of the century, her legend was taught in military ethics classes as an anonymous case study in moral courage. The Whitfield Principle, they called it. It stated simply, when rules fail, conscience must lead. No one could confirm its origin, but in every retelling, the same question lingered. Did she survive? Or did she become part of something larger? An echo that crossed enemy lines, a symbol that refused to die. Even in archives, her trail was strange. Her final medical inventory listed more blood transfused than her team had in stock. Her uniform was never recovered. Only her identification tag, scorched around the edges, found in the rubble days later. The initials still clear, EW. Yet among the soldiers she saved, everyone swore the same thing. She had not looked like someone ready to die. She had looked like someone with more work to do. And perhaps she did. Some mysteries are not meant to close. They remain as living things. Reminders that even when truth disappears beneath the ash of war, the light it casts still burns in the hands of those who follow. The nurse who did the unthinkable had shown the world that compassion could defy order, that courage could wear a simple uniform and speak softly through pain. Her legacy was not written in medals or documents, but in every medic who risked their life to keep another heartbeat going when logic said it was too late. The story ends where it began, in a quiet room, a lamp burning low, a pair of hands steadying under chaos. Somewhere between the lines of history, she still moves, unseen, unrecorded, unforgotten. Anchor subscribe now for more powerful hidden stories from World War II and Cold War aviation. Speech balloon comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Thumbs up like this video to help more history lovers discover it. Military Medal join the mission to keep these stories alive, because history's greatest revolutions often start with one person who refused to say, "That's just how it's done."